So, like I mentioned, my wife and I have been married for 22 years. And so, when you first get married, there's like a lot of change, obviously, that happens in your life. And, just a lot of differences and things like, everything's different and crazy. And so one of the crazy things, you learn stuff about the other person that you're like, I didn't know that. And so there was like several times the first like couple months that we were married that my wife, she kept waking up in the middle of the night. And she'd wake up and she was talking, and I'm like, it would wake me up because I'm a real light sleeper, and she would wake me up, and so like it was kind of freaking me out because it woke me up the one night. This is what I heard. It sounded like this: Jesus, 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 Jesus. And I'm like, my initial thing, because like I'm a newlywed. My initial thing is like, I'm like, oh my God, like this woman is so spiritual. She prays in her sleep, and I'm just thinking like, I'm done for. Like I cannot live up to this standard of life and spirituality. Like I'm done. And then like over time, not much time, but then I realized like she's afraid. Like she's up. Like there's something that's scaring her, and that's why she's waking up. And so I'm like, what's wrong, baby? You okay? What's wrong? And she's like, there's a man in the room. There's a man in the room. And I'm like, I know, baby. I'm right here. And she's like, no, there's another man in the room, and I'm like half asleep, and I'm like, well, why is there another man in our room, baby? Like that doesn't even make sense. Like, then I realized like, oh my goodness, like she thinks like there's another man in the room, at which point I'm like, I need to be the man at this point. And I'm like, I'm afraid of the dark. I'm afraid of everything. And I just grab the sheets and put them over my head. I'm like, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Cause I'm thinking like, if it worked for her, like I'm just, maybe it'll work for me as well. But for months though, like this little thing went on, and like after a while that happening on a routine basis, like there was like just fear. Like my wife was always afraid for a long time, like just, someone's going to break into our house, and obviously my husband is a wimp and he can't going to do anything about it. And of course my solution to that ultimately was to go buy a big dog, thinking that a big dog would protect me. Now the roles are reversed. Now I'm the one who wakes up. This is funny. All these years later, now I'm the one who wakes up scared to death at sounds that are going on. I'm like, baby, did you hear that? You hear that? She's like, yeah, it's the ice maker. Just go back to sleep. We're good. It's the dishwasher. Now, here's what happens in life, and this happens in ministry too. What happens to you and I in life and ministry is the more that certain behaviors or certain patterns are happen over and over and over again, the more that happens, the more you've created this thing, this buzzword that we call culture. Right? That's basically what we're talking about. And so you have a culture in your ministry. So let me give you the notes for this session real quick. So if you can put that first slide up for me real quick. If you just want a copy of the notes that I'm actually teaching from here, right there in the middle of the screen, if you go to that website, it's a direct link. So you can't go to just leadthegeneration.com. You have to type the whole thing in because it's a private link. And you'll see the title of this lesson called Creating a Healthy Culture in Your Ministry. Click on it. It'll let you download all the notes. You'll get all that stuff. You're probably going to get a little pop-up for like an email subscription. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but you can. But that'll give you the notes for it real quick, right? So that's going to come back on. It's leadthegeneration.com/resources. It'll give you all study notes for it, all that kind of stuff. And the lesson that I'm going to do here, and maybe in our last session tonight, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but the lesson I'm going to do here is actually a part of a series of coaching videos that we have developed. It's called Lead the Generation Mastermind. It's something that I've been talking with Pastor Chris about now for the last couple months. But we basically are developing a 6-month coaching strategy for youth pastors, whether you're full-time, whether you're part-time, whether you're bivocational, whether you're a volunteer. I don't know if your experience in youth ministry was like mine, but my experience when I started in youth ministry was I got hired, I went to church, I sat down at my desk, and I was like, what do I do now? Anyone else have that experience? Okay, so a lot of us are like, what do I do now? My second thought was, I sure hope they don't know that they hired a guy who doesn't really know what he's doing, right? And so then now you jump online, you go out, what do? You buy a bunch of resources, right? So you buy the Doug Field sermon series, right? And then you try to afford the orange curriculum, and then you try to, you try to do all this stuff. And those are all great resources. I'm not dinging any of them. They're great resources, but they're what I would classify as like a plug and play resource that basically is like, go preach this sermon, go do this small group study, go play this game. It's all great stuff. I needed someone to come alongside of me and actually teach me how to manage and run youth ministry. It wasn't that I didn't love students, or that I didn't know how to love students or go spend time with them or cheer them on at their football game or whatever it was. It was that I didn't know how to actually manage youth ministry, especially manage youth ministry in a long-term sense of achieving, like building a program that was going to produce the kind of students that I wanted to produce. And after I saw students graduating from my youth ministry and falling away from their faith, I realized, like, I don't really know how to do this. And so me and a handful of guys that all have about 20 years of youth ministry experience have gotten together. We've created this coaching program called Mastermind. When you're part of Mastermind, it's a 6-month experience. Each month, we release a module of videos to you. If you'll put that next slide up for me real quick. We release a module of videos to you that kind of gives you a look of what it looks like. Each module has about 4 videos, about an hour's worth of content. You work through that content on your own early in the month. Later in the month, you have a live coaching call through Zoom video with me or one of our Lead the Generation coaches, primarily just me though, and then we basically break down all that information, and we do a 90-minute coaching call that's a part of the program. And so you do that each month for 6 months, and each one of the topics builds on one another, and we're basically teaching you, how do I do youth ministry? And our number one goal at the beginning of the process is to help make a bigger, stronger, healthier you, because everything rises and falls on leadership. And then from there, we segue into how you actually lead other leaders and how you recruit and train volunteers and how you do all those things in the context of today's generation, Generation Z. And then from there, you start moving into other things like small groups and discipleship and evangelism and missions and serving in the local church and all that kind of stuff. So if that's something you're interested in, you can talk to Pastor Chris about it. We've actually talked about the potential of putting together a group from just Illinois here, so that you're in a group together, a community with just some of your own people that you already know. You can also go on our website, which is that link would be leadthegeneration.com/mastermind. You can check out some more information about it. So if you go back to that other slide real quick, just for those that maybe didn't get the notes yet, we'll just leave that one up there, and then you can follow along on the notes with me, because I want to talk about this culture thing, right? Because what happens a lot in our youth ministries is we don't understand why we're not effective. We don't understand what's going on. We don't understand how did this happen. It's kind of like my wife and I, where it's like, oh my gosh, why is there this thing where like one of us is always going to be afraid and we're always going to wake up? Well, it's culture that's created over time through behavior, right? So follow along. If you're following along in your notes with me real quick, you have a culture. You have a culture in your ministry. You have a culture in your church. Let me define it for you real quick, because we throw that word around a lot, especially in leadership circles, and sometimes we're not all on the same page for what it means. Culture is a combination of belief and behavior. Belief and behavior. So let me explain it like this. Your culture being belief, that's what you say you believe. That's like your church's mission statement, right? That's like the values that you have posted on the wall somewhere in your youth room. It's like your cool phrases. It's like, this is who we are. This is the name of our youth ministry, right? And we're trying to become this way. We're uncommon youth. We're real life youth. We're extreme, lovers and disciples and followers of Jesus Christ. Hopefully that's not your name. That's really long. That's a part of your culture. It's what you believe you are and how you state those beliefs. But the second part of your culture is your behavior. So that's the way you behave, or that's the way that you lead, or that's the way that your leaders lead, or that's the way that your students behave. Now, here's how culture is formed. It's either formed by default or it's formed intentionally. You have a culture right now in your youth ministry, in your church. You have a culture. It might be a culture that you inherited, or it might be a culture that you behaved your way into, which could be hard for you to admit when you look around. You're like, oh my God, did I create this? Right? Or it's a culture that you intentionally sat down and thought, I'm going to lay out what kind of culture I want to create in our ministry, the way in which we treat people, the way in which we do ministry, the way in which we approach ministry, and I'm going to intentionally make steps towards that. When you do it intentionally, that's when, follow along with me real quick, I want to make sure you understand this, that's when your belief and your behavior are very close to one another, meaning there's a very small gap, if any gap at all, between those two things. Healthy culture, let me say it like this. Healthy culture is when your belief and your behavior are the same. They all work together. Does that make sense? Right? Unhealthy culture, and you've probably all experienced it. You might actually be in it right now, or you've seen it, or your friends have talked to you about it. Unhealthy culture, all unhealthy culture is when there's a large gap between what we say we believe and what we actually live out. Does that make sense? So when we talk about culture, that's what we're really dealing with here, is like, if it's a bad toxic culture, it's just because there's a huge gap between those two things. If there's a good healthy culture, it's because someone intentionally set out to say, I'm going to build my culture, and I'm going to build it intentionally. And oh, by the way, I'm going to rebuild it over and over and over and over and over again, because it's never just a one-time thing. Right? Now, here was my struggle when I started in youth ministry. I didn't think about culture. No one sat down with me and talked to me and said, hey, you really need to think about the kind of youth ministry you're building and growing and your values and what's important. And because, all of those things are going to lead to creating a culture. I got about 4 or 5 years in. I'm crazy frustrated in ministry. And my goal, this was my thought, just to tell you how simplistic my thought process was when I first started in youth ministry. This was in 2001. I was so simplistic in my thought process. Here's what I'm thinking. All I need to do is have a good sounding band and preach good sermons, and we're just going to blow up and reach thousands of kids for Jesus. Wouldn't it be great if it was that easy? I mean, that would be great. Like, especially like if you're like good at either one of those two things, you'd be like, this is awesome. But that's what it was. And so for me, I set out to create the best Wednesday night youth service that I could possibly create. With the facility I had to work with the budget I had to work with the people. I mean, it was all about the program. It was just all about it's got to be perfect. And I'm telling you, man, I'm driving this thing, and I'm like pushing the band, I'm pushing the leaders. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be on cue. The lights had to be perfect. The haze, the smoke, like everything that we had to work with, it all had to be perfect. It's got to be just boom, right on. And it's not happening for me. And people are getting mad, and leaders are burning out, and people are leaving, and students want to stop volunteering, and I didn't understand what was going on. But I had created a very program-driven culture. And I was out to eat one night with one of my friends. He actually became a coach, which was a life-changing moment for me. I would just highly encourage you. This is not a sales pitch on my part. I would just encourage you to get a coach. Whether it's something through what I do, or whether it's through Pastor Chris, or just some of the other leaders that are here in the room that are maybe a step ahead of you, get yourself a coach. And but I'm sitting with this guy. His name is Darren, and I'm venting one night, and I'm just like, Darren, man, things are just bad. I can't get anyone to do it. I can't get the band to play on key. I can't get the vocalist, blah 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 blah. I can't get the lighting guy to not making like people pass out from seizures in the middle of the worship because the lights are so bad. Sounds terrible. It's feedback. The whole I'm just complaining. I get my leaders to show up on time, and then they leave early. Blah, blah. I'm just like going on and on and on, and it's just. And so he looks at me, and he's just like, hey. He's like, hey, man, we're good friends, right? I'm like, yeah, man. He's like, well, I know what your problem is. I'm like, all right, good. Tell me. Tell me what. He's just like, your problem is that you love programs and you use people. And real youth ministry is when you love people and you use programs. That I'm telling you, that for me, that was like one of those catalytic moments with like serious directional shift in my thinking towards youth ministry in that moment. And all of a sudden it was like the blinders and the scales fell off my eyes, and all of a sudden I realized, man, I have created a culture here in my ministry where the only thing that matters is if the Wednesday night service goes well. That's all that matters. Pre-service, post-service, that's the only thing that matters. And so none of my kids are really connecting relationally. None of my kids are really feeling loved. All of my kids are basically not liking me because I'm blowing them off, walking past them before the service rather than hanging out with students and building relationships. I'm too worried to make sure that the sound guy is getting everything right and that my sermon slides are great and that everything's put together. And so I'm just walking right past people all the time. This was a culture I had created. Listen, I hope you understand this. I didn't believe that. If I verbally told you what our youth ministry was all about, I would have said things like, we're about loving students, we're about building relationships, we're about discipling kingdom builders and those who are going to change the world. That's what I said, but my actions and my behavior created the exact opposite sort of culture. So that's what I'm talking about when I create culture. So I want you just to kind of put your thinking cap on for a second, because I don't know what kind of culture you might have already created in your youth ministry. I don't know what your thoughts or philosophy even is towards ministry. I'm just going to give you mine. Is that okay? And I'll tell you up front, I'm not the kind of guy who thinks that I'm right. And so at least at this point in my life, I'm not. I'm going to give you what my culture became and what my beliefs and philosophy and values became towards student ministry. I think for some of you, it'll be a confirmation of what you're doing in ministry. For some of you, it'll be kind of like, that's just kind of making me rethink a couple things in my ministry. Because I went from the hard shift of it's all about program, excellence, all the way to the other side of, you know what it's really about? It's about love. It's about relationships. It's about connecting with students. It's about me and my leaders building the best relationships that we can build with students. And we restructured our entire youth ministry around those values. And we basically created this culture where students knew I'm in a relationship with an adult who really cares about me. I heard a story when I was prepping for this message, when we put this together a while ago, but I heard a story of an exchange student. She was a Buddhist. She came from a Eastern country, and she came to America, and she had a host home. Her host family were Christians. And so they took her to church every week, and that was a new experience for her. And so this went on for months and months and months. She was Buddhist in her religion, but she was going to a Christian church. And after months and months and months of this, one Sunday morning, the pastor, he gave an invitation for salvation, and she got saved. And just incredible. And so after the service was over, the pastor came up to the young girl, and he started talking with her. He said, what was it? Like, what was it that I said in the sermon that like helped you make that decision? Typical preacher, right? What did I do that I can repeat and do over and over and over? And she said, "Oh, pastor," she said, it had nothing to do with you. She said, "Ever since I've been coming to this country, my host mom has been building a relationship with me." And she said, "Today I feel like Jesus took a walk on the bridge between her heart and my heart." And I began out, like, when I first read that, and I was working with our youth leaders and doing training with them, I was like, boom, this is it. Like, this is what I want. Like, I want leaders that are going to build relational bridges with students that can bear the weight of truth. Like, this is what matters more. This is better. This is more than me being able to preach a great sermon or the band being able to kill it. Like, I need leaders that are going to be able to build relationships with students that are going to bear the weight of truth. So ultimately, we're dealing here with the question of like in your youth ministry right now, in the culture of your youth ministry, whether it's large, whether it's small, whether you have hundreds of kids, whether you have tens of kids, whether you have 3 kids, it doesn't really matter. We're talking about something that's cultural here that applies across the board, no matter the size. Whether you're volunteer, part-time, bivocational, full-time, you have the opportunity through your belief and through your behavior to create culture. What kind of culture are you creating? And is it a culture that values the relationships that are created between adults and students as one of the highest priorities that you're accomplishing in youth ministry right now? So what most of us have done in youth ministry, not really understanding it or not really thinking about it, is we finally got our opportunity to be a youth pastor. Maybe you started as a volunteer, maybe you still are, you're doing it part-time, or maybe it's your first full-time opportunity. But you've inherited some culture and you've inherited some program from the way that church did youth ministry before. Everybody with me? And so you basically say, I'm just going to continue this. Or you basically were like, well, this is how youth ministry was done in the church that I grew up in. And so you're basically trying to recreate what you experienced as a student in the church that you're in now. That might be true for some of you. Some of you maybe didn't grow up in church. And so you're just like, dude, I don't even know where to begin. Like, I hear that people preach sermons, so I figure I got to preach sermons. I heard that people do worship, so I figure I got to do worship. I want you to come back to a philosophical foundation of basically saying the number one thing that I have to achieve in the culture of my youth ministry is the relationship between an adult and a student. Like, let me like kind of give you some statistics on why I'm so passionately thinking like this is the way youth ministry needs to head, especially in the day and age we're in with Generation Z, right? There's been a massive shift that's taken place in our society and our culture, especially when it comes to relationship and when it comes to family relationship. If you scroll back all the way to the 1960s, for every 1,000 kids in our country, only 7 of them had to deal with the divorce of their parents. Now, it's well over 50%, if not higher. I mean, if you know the kids in your youth ministry, whether you got 10 kids or whether you got 100 kids, you probably know that you stand up there on a Wednesday night or whenever your service is, you stand up there, and over half the kids you're talking to come from some sort of broken or dysfunctional family, right? So that's a relational rift that's taking place in our country. We have a generation of young people that are growing up in families where the culture of their family is teaching them adults can't be trusted. Now hang on to that thought, because then it gets even further and further and further for us, especially in America, because in America, we're the number one country in the world right now of fatherlessness. So we got a generation of kids that don't have a father. We have a generation of young men that don't really understand what it means to be a man. And so they follow all of the cultural norms and everything that they see on TV and media and whatnot. And then on the top of that statistic, you have American parents being rated as the parents across the world that spend the least amount of time with their kids on a daily basis. Right. Now, read this quote to you real quick. This is from Mark DeVries. Mark DeVries wrote a brilliant book. It's called The Family-Based Youth Ministry. It would be a great read for you. Mark says this. He says, research has proven again and again that from the project to the penthouse, the crucial factor for kids who make it to maturity, not just Christian maturity. So we're just talking about basic maturity now, right? is the presence of at least one supportive adult in their life. So he's basically saying all the research is saying that in order for a kid to make it to any sort of maturity in life, not just Christian maturity, is a relationship with an adult, right? He goes on and he says this, and those who make it to Christian maturity almost always have what I call an extended family of godly adults in their lives. When a youth program fails to provide relational connections between students and godly adults, it fails in its fundamental mission. But wait, there's more. Okay, statistics have shown that students, now listen to this out. This is going to be encouraging, especially if you're in a small ministry context right now. Statistics have shown that students that have grown into solid Christian adults have discovered that the youth program of a large church or the lack thereof in a small church has made no difference. Right? Now, I'm not saying that as an indictment on those of you that are youth pastoring in a large church. I youth pastored in both a small church and a large church in my tenure, right? I'm just simply saying that it's easy for us to fall into the trap of thinking that bigger is always better or that bigger is more effective, right? Or it's easy for us to fall into the trap of thinking that because we're small, this is the trap for when you're in a small context, it's easy to think that because you're in a small context that relationships automatically just naturally happen. No, it's all about us intentionally creating culture, regardless of the size of your context, saying, no. This has to be a major priority. Like, we need to figure out how to create a culture where students are connecting with parents with adults in a relational way. Like, this has to be the most important aspect of youth ministry. I would suggest to you, this is more important than how good your preaching is, or how good your band is, or how many trips or events or retreats that you might have. This is more important. This is more important than whether you've got a great youth room or no youth room at all. This is more important than whether you have 100 kids coming to youth ministry or whether you got 7 kids sitting in your living room once a week. You creating a culture where students are creating a relationship with kids. In a biblical sense, I'll say it like this. What the culture that I believe we really should be after in youth ministry today is a culture of spiritual fatherhood and spiritual motherhood. It's a culture where we basically say, as church leaders, as followers of Christ, our goal is to fill in the gap where a student has lost a parent or both parents or any sense of Christian relationship, right? I'm going to fill in the gap, and I'm going to become a spiritual mom or spiritual dad. Now, let me just encourage you real quick. This took me 8 years of full-time youth ministry to figure out. It just took me forever because I was so stuck in my thought of everyone just needs to hear me preach. We just need to do bigger, better outreach. I just need a bigger budget. I just need to spend more money on more prizes to get more kids to want to bring their friends to come. And if we do these things, and by the way, I'm not dissing all that stuff and saying don't do any of that stuff. That might be very much a part of how God uses you in your ministry. I'm saying I completely missed out on this aspect of relationships and the value of relationships between the adult and between the student. And when all of a sudden I figured this out, I was like, oh my gosh. I need to train myself as well as my leaders how to become a spiritual mom and a spiritual dad. This has to be our number one priority. We ended up restructuring our entire ministry. Obviously, small groups was a major part of that. You and I can talk online in a different setting about that if you want to. Our small group model versus other models. I don't know that there's anything necessarily right or wrong. It's just different ways to do it. But we basically restructured everything around small groups. But it wasn't so much about small groups as much as it was about the student building a great, healthy Christian relationship with adults. And all of my cultural verbiage in ministry changed to where I began to regularly refer to my small group leaders as spiritual moms and dads. Because I wanted them to feel the weight of that. I wanted that you're more than just big brother, big sister. You're more than just cool young adult who's helping out in your youth ministry. You're more than just a mom who has a heart to be involved and you're a spiritual mom and dad to a broken generation of kids. So how do you do it? Now, here's where this will get real nuts and bolts pragmatic for you. That was a little heady, philosophical. Now this will be more pragmatic. And so I'm going to train you in 3 areas, and this is how I train my leaders. So basically, for the sake of argument, if you were all my small group leaders, this is a lesson that I would have done with you, and that's why I make the notes available for you to download, so that if this is something that really fits your culture and your calling, you can basically say, cool, I've got some leadership training stuff right at my fingertips that I can use to basically train my leaders and how to be spiritual moms and dads. So 3 things that I wanted my leaders to do. I wanted them to show them, I wanted them to tell them, and I wanted them to give them. And I kind of would like break those down, and then 1 week in a training I might talk about here's things we want to show kids, and 1 week give them, and 1 week tell them. So kind of break it down, follow along your notes if you got them. Show them maturity. Show them maturity. I had to always come back to encourage my leaders, my young adult leaders, and also in 2 different ways. I'm encouraging my young adult leaders, but also encouraging my older leaders, that the number one thing that they could do as an adult is show students how to live a mature Christian adult life, right? Because there's this misnomer in youth ministry that you can't really do youth ministry effectively unless you're young and cool and relevant. That's a lie. By the way, love is always relevant. Just saying. But by the way, an adult who really loves and cares for a student will actually get much more out of the relationship with that student than the other person who is really cool and is really young and is really relevant but doesn't want to build a relationship with them. And so I was always saying to my young adult leaders, like, listen, I know it's hard for you to wrap your head around becoming a spiritual parent because you're like 21 years old. You're like, I'm not even married, let alone have kids. How to put my head around this? But maturity in your life right now, spiritual maturity in your life is one of the most important things you need to develop so that you can pass that on to the next generation. And to the older adults in the room, I would say to them, stop trying to be cool because you're not and you never will be. And it's okay. And guess what? Students don't even need you to be or even necessarily want you to be. They just want you to know their name and love them whenever they show up to our youth service. Right? And so I'm like, you need to show them what maturity looks like. If you were a married couple and one of our leaders, I would say the number one gift that you might have to give this generation is to show them what a healthy Christian marriage looks like. Because they don't know. They're not seeing it. Right? And so I would say to them all the time, I'm like, listen, just invite them over to your house. Just let them come over and hang out with you. Like I would say to my leaders, you don't have to go to every football game. Just invite kids over to your house so they can see what a Christian married couple looks like and how they function together in a home. Because for some kids in our generation, family, that's a bad word. Because their definition of it is like, oh, let me tell you about my family, or the fact that I don't have one. Some of you know, because you're looking at me and I can see it in your face, that you grew up in a situation where you're like, yeah, let me tell you about my family. So we have to redefine that for this generation, and maturity is a big part of that, right? Jeannie May always says it like this. She says, you reproduce who you are, not what you teach. And so let kids like get up close and up personal to you, right? Now, think about this. I did some research on this. This is amazing to me. But every generation, you can see there's a shift in when adolescence begins and when it ends. This is going to get real heady here for a second, and then we'll go back into the practical. In every generation, there's a shift of when adolescence begins and when it ends. Because of medical discoveries and the technology of health in our country, kids are hitting puberty earlier than they've ever hit it before, right? But because of the lack of relationships with adults, especially in the family context, what's happening on the back end? On the back end, kids are staying in an adolescent season of their life longer than ever before. Did you know that in our country right now, marriage for millennials and Generation Z is heading to an average age of around 30? So here's what we've done. We're basically letting kids hit puberty and hit adolescence at like 10 and 11 years old from a medical perspective, and then they're living in this swamp of puberty, we'll call it, for like 2 decades, right? And this is what happens when the family unit breaks down. This is what happens when a young person doesn't have genuine, authentic relationships with adults. Now, society makes it even harder because the society that you and I live in is a society that's decided to glorify and to worship youth. So if you're young and you're cool, that's what everybody wants. In previous generations, it plays out like this. In previous generations, you had 12-year-old boys who were dressing like their fathers because they couldn't wait to grow up and become adults. Now you have fathers that want to dress like their sons. I'm one of them, by the way. But I'm just, someone came up to me and they're like, I really like your shoes. And I was like, yeah, my son bought them for me for Christmas because I told him, Caleb, I need a really cool pair of shoes. And he was like, I got you, Dad. Right? But think on a deeper level what that does to society. We now have a society where once you're old, you're useless. And your life is only effective whenever you're young. I see this same trend in student ministry. It bothers me so much because by the time average youth pastors get into their late 20s or their 30s, they start saying to themselves, I'm too old. I've aged out. And I'm sitting there thinking, no, you finally just figured out life. Like you finally figured out how to live life as a spiritual mom or spiritual dad. Like no. You're going to go into the best, most effective, fruitful season of your ministry if you just hang in there. You're going to model something for kids right now that they can't get from the 21-year-old youth pastor. And that's not a slam on those of you that are younger. I'm just saying there's some stuff you go through in life that you can pass on to the next generation, but you can't give up and say, "Oh, I'm too old." But all of this basically combines with our society focusing itself on adolescence, and adolescents then think it's cool to be young, and what that ends up doing is it impedes their journey towards adulthood. And so at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, we've got 30-year-olds that are still living in mom's basement, playing 12 hours a fortnight, trying to figure out what am I going to do with my life. In a spiritual sense, we got people sitting there saying to themselves, I can't figure out how to run my race. Well, yeah, you're not going to figure out how to run your race whenever you spend all of your time on Facebook watching someone else run their race. This is what's happened. So to me, that's why the answer to this is not better preaching. It's not. The answer to this is better relationships between young people and adults, to where a young person can see, oh, this is what it looks like. It's maturity. And I'll give you a couple more, right? So I want you to show them the maturity. I want you to show them your passion. Oh, man, one of my pet peeves with my leaders was like whenever worship was going on and they were just all like hanging out in the back of the room. And I'm like, oh, you know what I mean? Like I'm trying so hard to get kids to learn how to engage with God and worship, and the leaders in the back of the room like sipping lattes and like, oh, hey, how was your day? Hey, did you get the promotion at work? Yeah, blah, blah, blah. You know, like, oh, boy, that would kill me. So I had to train my leaders and just say, listen, kids need to see you. They need to see you up front. They need to see you worship. They need to see you pray. They need to see you cry. They need to see you act like a Christian. I know it's hard. but that's that's why you're here. Like that's what your job. So we had this thing in a practical sense. We had this thing in my youth ministry that I had to do. I didn't want to do it. I just had to do it. We called it the 6-foot rule. And the 6-foot rule was that if you're an adult, you're not allowed to stand any closer than 6 feet to any wall in our youth room. Because all they wanted to do was lean against the walls. And so I was like, oh, 6 foot. And I had one leader that I trusted that basically he was like the 6-foot rule security guy. And he's like, I could see him in the service, like walking along the back wall. Step off, yeah, step off. A little close, But I was like, my God, like goodness, And eventually what happened was that segued into my leaders learning culturally. They need to be sitting with their students. They needed to be worshiping with their students. Because we were so small group driven, you need to be sitting with your small group and all that. So show them your passion. Here's another one. Show them your attention. Show them your attention. In a similar sense, like I want leaders to come in with the mindset of, I've got this short window of time that I can spend with students, so I'm going to leverage it from the moment I walk in to the moment that I leave. My attention is going to be fully focused on students. Maybe your volunteer leaders are perfect, but my volunteer leaders, it seemed like they were more excited to see the other volunteer leaders than they were to see the students. And I'm like, come on, man, like this doesn't work, right? And so I had to shift that. But here's what I realized. This is practical nuts and bolts for me. The reason my leaders felt that way was because I didn't give them any intentional time to actually be with one another. So we started doing, and maybe this will be helpful for you, we started doing a pre-service huddle. It was about 15 minutes long. I had a certain time when I wanted all my leaders to come in, and it was just the leaders. And I fed them a ton of caffeine to help them like get excited, right? They loved that. It was free. It was coffee, whatever. We prayed together. I gave them some brief instruction for the night, and then boom. And then when they would leave the room, then it was like, okay, game face, let's go. Now you're with students. Here's the funny thing. I would then catch leaders hanging out in the room. And so I had to kick them out. Okay, here we go. All right, service is starting. All right, everybody out. Okay, I'm talking to you two over there. Let's go, But what am I trying to do? I'm trying to make my speech, my belief match up with my behavior. Because it's not enough. Did I just turn it off? I just turned it off. It's not enough. All right, it's coming back on. Here it is. Check. Here we go. No, I'm good. I got 2 bars. I just hit the button by accident. It's not enough. It's not enough for me just to talk about being a spiritual mom and dad and showing attention to kids. I have to make sure they're actually living that out as well. One more under show them. Show them your faithfulness. Show them your faithfulness. right? You're going to have to constantly encourage your leaders with the thought that youth ministry is not a sprint, but it's a marathon. And that because we're dealing with a generation of students that society has taught to not trust adults, okay, you're not going to win them over in a week. You're not going to win them over in 1 month. You're not going to win them over in 2 months. You're only going to win them over by your consistency, by your faithfulness. There's this misnomer in life, and it segues over into ministry as well, but there's this misnomer in life that at some point, somehow, some way, you'll find the magic recipe, and then you'll have like this overnight fame and explosion of like all this good, like at some point you're just going to do the right outreach, and you're going to go from like 10 kids in your youth ministry to like 30 kids. You're going to triple in size, and it's just going to be absolutely incredible. I'm just telling you, it doesn't exist. I just don't think it does. I think that it's more about long-term faithfulness in the same direction. And this is what's funny about society, right? The thing that we say that we value the most is things like people that have been married for 50 years or the person who just was faithful for a long time. But then all we want to talk about and pay attention to is all of the things that look like it was overnight success. It just doesn't work. If you follow college basketball at all, you've probably heard of the name John Wooden, right? He was a famous coach for UCLA. And at one point in like the whole mix of his tenure and his basically what he did, he had like 7 championships in a row and all this stuff. And in the midst of all that height and all that fame, there was a reporter and stuck a microphone in his face, and they're like, Coach Wooden, tell us about the magic moment. Like tell us about the moment when just everything happened. Like you just like, man, went from zero to hero. And I love his answer. He said, there was no magic moment. He said, I spent 15 years showing up every single day, doing the little faithful things over and over and over again before we had any success in this program. And that's actually the true history of John Wooden. 15 years of coaching before they ever won even one of those championships. No one paid attention to him then. Listen to me. Can I just encourage you real quick? Especially if you're in a season of ministry or you're in a context that you feel like is not very important, or maybe you've been somewhere for several years and you haven't seen the growth and you haven't really accomplished the dreams or goals that you've wanted. Just keep showing up. Just keep showing up. Just keep making a difference. Just keep investing in the next generation. Let me put it in a real spiritual context for you. You and I fall prey to the thought process that impacting the kingdom of God is about something that we will do or something that we will accomplish. I'm learning to believe in this season of my life that the greatest thing I might do for the kingdom of God is not what I will do, but it's who I will raise up. And just for some of you, especially those of you that feel bad or you feel like you're not as qualified as the person who's sitting beside you because of the size of your ministry, listen, you might have 5 kids in your youth ministry, but they all might be 5 world changers that you invested in. And that's what I'm trying to help you understand. I don't care so much about the what anymore in my life. I don't care about the stats anymore. None of that stuff. What matters the most is who am I raising up and pouring into and investing in the next generation, right? So show them your faithfulness, right? This is all the show them section. A couple more here. Tell them, right? We'll talk tell them, and then we'll talk give them. Tell them your story. Teach your leaders to share their story. Teach your leaders to understand how to share their story of finding Christ, their story of what they've been through, their story of what they've experienced. Here's what, you probably already know this, I'm just reminding you of it. Here's what you need to be reminded of about Generation Z. They've got an unbelievable meter to detect phony and fake. Right? Right? Can I say it the way I really wanted to say it? Like they can see BS coming from a long ways away, right? Okay? And so when we get like too churchy and too Christian and we make our lives out to be like everything was perfect, that just turns off the relationship between a Generation Z kid and between the leader. And so you have to come alongside of your leaders and say, listen, here's the right and healthy and proper way for you to be authentic and transparent about what you've gone through in life. Does that make sense? Because there's certain things in your adult leaders' lives that you don't necessarily want them sharing with your kids. So there's definitely a balance here, but you have to teach them how to do that. Here's the damage if you don't. If you don't, there will be some who won't talk about it at all, and they'll forfeit their right to build genuine, authentic spiritual relationship with students. For the others, they'll talk about way too much, And you'll be in there throwing buckets of water on the fire that they're setting because they're talking about stuff that you're like, you had no business like having this conversation with a 12-year-old. Like, what are you thinking, right? So, but that's where you as a leader have to step into the equation and say, cool, I'm going to teach you how to tell them. Tell them what? Tell them your story. Now, I want you to think about this from a biblical perspective real quick. When you look through the totality of Scripture and you look at the way in which one generation passed their faith on to the next generation, in the Bible, there were always three constructs that you see over and over and over again for how a young person segued from youth to adulthood, all right, or from immaturity to maturity. First, it was family. God always used the family unit first, which, oh, by the way, is why Satan always attacks the family, right? Which is one of the reasons why most of our churches are falling apart, is because family's under attack. And who does he attack first in the family? He attacks the leader of the family, which biblically speaking is the man, right? And so this is the reason why like some of our youth ministries struggle and our churches struggle, and we're girl heavy. And I'm not against that at all. But if you sit down and do a survey or just do the math with your church, you'll find out that on average most of our churches have a 60 to 40 ratio between men and women. I mean, between women and men. 20% more towards women. And that's what we have in serving as well. Do you understand what that's doing, culturally speaking, to young men? Because they're not learning how to step up and take leadership. And so the society and the devil has basically targeted all of his attack on the young man. Now, here's the opposite effect for you and I as leaders. If you can heal the man, you can heal the family. If you heal the family, you can heal the nation that's broken right now. And that's what has to take, and it has to start in our youth ministries, though. So in a biblical construct, it was the family first, and then it was the church, and then it was peer influence. Those were the three things in that order that biblically you would see a person segueing from like being a young person into adulthood. Now in our society, what do we see now? Flip. It's the exact opposite. It's peer influence, then it's the church, and then at the very bottom, it's the family. Here's the scary reality. We have a generation of young people that are learning how to do life through Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram and through the influence of their friends. We sent all of our kids off to these big red brick buildings called schools and basically said, you should emulate whatever you see there among your peers. That's what you should try to do. Just try to be a better version of that. That's why we're in so much trouble in our youth ministries, because we haven't taken the time to sit and be like, what am I doing? And this, again, to me, this backs up the reason why I'm saying you building a culture where relationships between students and adults is the number one priority is so important, because you can never raise up tomorrow's young man if there's not today's godly man who's investing and pouring into him. Right? And so we got to get back to that. This is all a part of telling your story, right? Tell them your story. Tell them your fears. Just teaching leaders how to be transparent. We kind of talked about that already. Tell them about your faith in Christ. Teach your leaders how to always point it back to Jesus. Teach your leaders how to be gospel-centric in everything, especially when it comes to the difficult questions that they're going to deal with, right? Because your leaders are going to deal with you're going to deal with difficult questions, right? And you're going to have to give some time and thought. And again, this doesn't matter the context or the size of your youth ministry. You're going to have to give them some time. You're going to have to give yourself, sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I say this right. You're going to have to give yourself some time and thought on how you're going to coach and train your leaders to point things back to Jesus, especially when they get asked difficult questions. Because you're dealing with a generation, and I'm going to give you like a 1-minute version of a lesson that I did with my leaders, and we can unpack it more in a different setting at some point. But one of the things that we were really dealing with in our youth ministry for quite a season was students that felt like they were dealing with same-sex attraction. And I leader after leader coming to me and like, I don't know what to say, and I don't know how to point this back to Jesus. And you're telling me that this is part of being spiritual parent is to wade into the mucky, dirty, waters of all this stuff. Like how do I do this? And so we basically came up. You can write this down. This might be helpful for you. I said to my leaders, I did a training. I just said to them, listen, there's 3 things I want you to remember. This is how you point things back to Jesus. When a kid comes to you and they say, hey, I think I'm gay, or I'm dealing with this, or blah, blah, blah. Number 1, you are the church. You're the church. And so your response in this moment is very important. It's weight. There's weight to your response when a kid comes to you and they like drop that big thing on you. You're the church. What does that mean? That means that the way that you respond to this student right now in this moment will probably be their definition or understanding of the entire church's response. And so if you don't respond correctly, then you might turn a kid off to church for the rest of their life. So you're the church. But secondly, number 2, you're not a counselor. So on one moment I'm putting pressure on, and the next moment I'm taking it all off. Because I'm basically saying to my leaders, listen, I know a kid comes to you, they say I'm struggling with same-sex attraction. What do? You're not a counselor. You don't have to fix it. I said to my leaders, even if you are a professional licensed therapist, in this moment and in this context, you're not a counselor. Because I don't want you to try to fix this. And then the third thing I said to them, and again, there's a lot more to this. I'm just giving you a brief overview. I said to them, you are a navigator. You're a navigator. And so what I need you to do is navigate this conversation so that it's not a one-time conversation, but so that it happens over and over and over and over and over again. That's the relational part, right? For those of you that are parents in the room, when one of your kids comes to you and they say to you, here's what I'm wrestling with, here's what I'm dealing with. Was it a one-time conversation and then you just tried to fix it? Or did you just kick them out and say, you're out of the family right now? Sorry you have this problem? When my 13-year-old son came to me and said, Dad, I've been looking at pornography, what do? I didn't kick him out of the family. I said, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. It's become an ongoing conversation every year of his teenage life at some point during the year. Out of nowhere, we'll just be driving along and I'll be like, hey, man, how's it going with porn? And it's like just as casual as like, hey, dude, how the Lakers doing? Because there's an ongoing conversation that needs to take place there. And that's what I mean when I say you're trying to train your leaders, to point them back to Christ and make it Jesus-centric, is that there are some conversations that your leaders are going to have where the only answer they're going to have is, man, let's just get close to Jesus right now. That has to be an ongoing conversation over and over and over again, all right? So you got to show them some things. You got to tell them some things. Got a couple minutes left. You got to give them some things. So you got to give them your time. You got to give them your time. Find creative ways to coach your leaders on how to spend time with students. Here's the rule with Generation Z. He who spends the most time wins. So whoever spends the most time is what's going to win influence in their life. So it's either going to be YouTube, or it's going to be their adolescent friends, right? Or it's going to be their boyfriend or girlfriend, or it's going to be their sport that they play, or it's going to be you as a leader. So what that means, though, because we all live busy lives, is you got to find some creative ways. My wife was a full-time school teacher all the years that she was a small group leader. The only way that she could spend time to spend with her girls and with her small group. They all call her Mama Julie. By the way, they all still call her Mama Julie. By the way, her relationships with those girls are so strong that 5 years after they've graduated from high school, they all still show up at her house randomly throughout the year, and they all still text her almost weekly. Hey, Mama Julie, I met a boy. What should I do? Run. But you have to find. So what my wife did was she would take girls out grocery shopping with her after church. She would take girls over the house and bake Christmas cookies. All the stuff she was going to do anyways, she just tried to include a student into it. Because she didn't have time to go to every single game. So some leaders have the time to do that. Go do that. Some leaders don't, right? So you're going to have to coach your leaders, right? But he who spends the most time wins. That's biblical, by the way, right? Galatians 6:7 says you reap what you sow. So if you want to sow some good things relationally, then you're going to have to put something into it, right? Give them your words of affirmation. This is probably the most negative society that we've ever had here in America, right? I mean, I could say one or two words and we could just create political upheaval here in this room, right? Because it's just everyone's on edge. Our whole country is at a boiling point right now. But students live in that all the time because they live in the negativity of their broken, dysfunctional family. They live in the negativity of the public high school that they're in or whatever that is. How bad is it that they have to live in all that and then potentially come into a toxic youth ministry church culture that can be just as negative towards them? Did you know that the sociologists did a study on this? They said that between the relationship of the student to parent, it's 8-1 in favor of negativity. On the flip side, for every one negative thing that's said to a person, it typically takes 7 positive things to be said to outweigh emotionally what they've experienced from the negative thing. We're dealing with one of the most beat-up generations of all time. And so you got to teach your leaders how to be over-the-top affirming in everything that they say and the way that they say. So give them your words of affirmation. 2 more and we're done. Give them your prayers. Give them your prayers. I teach your leaders how to have prayer lists, how to be praying for the students all the time, how to have pictures of their kids, how to be thinking about that all the time. Satan laughs at your strategies and your programs, but he trembles at your prayers. And you got to teach your leaders that and help them understand that the real power, spiritually speaking, is not in how good of a small group leader you are and you can facilitate the conversation and you're cool and you have money to make cookies and you have time to go spend, time at their games and stuff like that and you make them laugh. No. It really comes down to your prayers. Here's the last one. Give them your heart. Give them your heart. Jeannie says it like this. She says, youth ministry is like putting your stick on a heart and just putting it out there for the world to crush and trample. And I think sometimes in life and ministry, if you're not, I hate to say it this way, but I just know it's true because I've been through it. And some of you that have been doing youth ministry for like one day, this is true too. Every once in a while, you're going to get crushed. And if you're not getting crushed every once in a while, you're probably not doing it right. You probably don't care enough, and you probably don't love enough, and you're probably not spending enough time doing it. All right? So that's it. That's how I would train my leaders. I would take them through one or two of those things. I would remind them of those things in some pre-huddles. I would remind them of those things in some of our quarterly trainings that we did. The verbiage of the culture was all about, culture and spiritual fatherhood and spiritual motherhood. And we took that and we owned that, and to this day, man, I got kids that I call my kids. And they're in their 20s, and I'm like, hey, kiddo, how you doing? They call me and they say, hey, Dad, I got a question for you. And your spiritual kids, your spiritual moms, your spiritual dads. My wife and I the same way. But to me, and again, I'm not saying I'm 100% right on this. I'm just saying I believe that's the number one value and culture that you need to build in your youth ministry. Now, here's the good news. It doesn't take any money to do that. It doesn't take a big church to do that. It doesn't even take a paycheck to do that, or a youth room, or a good band, or the ability to preach a good sermon. It just takes intentionality on your part as a volunteer or part-time, bivocational, full-time to say, you know what, I'm going to focus on what really matters most, and it's building a culture of spiritual parenthood, spiritual fatherhood, spiritual motherhood. All right, so we're done. It's a couple minutes after. I think we have some important foosball tournaments that we need to hit right now, and more coffee we need to drink, good stuff like that.